it's hard to convey. And with the imagery we take, we attempt to convey that experience. But gosh, especially with how rich and like how in the moment you have to be climbing in the mountains, it's so hard to truly convey that experience. And if anything, as your work has done, and I hope my work has done, hopefully inspires others to take that step outside and experience whatever outdoor space they're able to visit and experience themselves, whether it's a mountain range or another natural area. So that's all we can hope. And I guess a lifetime spent attempting to create work that truly conveys that experience and the depth of that connection with that local landscape. I'd say that's a life well lived.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Payne, and this is episode 454 of F-Stop, Collaborate and Listen. Each week, we dig into creativity, inspiration, and the craft of photography with thoughtful conversations that go far beyond camera gear. Today, I'm joined by mountain photographer and climbing partner to the Cascades, Scott Kranz. Scott went from practicing law to building a life shaped almost entirely by the mountains of Washington State. In this conversation, we explore his leap into full-time photography, the way the Cascades reshaped his identity, the technical and mental challenges of mountain work, and the lessons he learned from massive long-term projects photographing the Northern Cascades. We also dive into his upcoming book, Cascade High, and how he's weaving years of climbing, story, and purpose into a cohesive narrative. And if you enjoy conversations about meaning making in photography, be sure to check out the Patreon bonus episode where Scott and I go even deeper into how mountains have shaped our creative lives. Okay, here's my conversation with Scott Kranz. All right, Scott Kranz, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Matt, thanks for having me. Really excited for the conversation.
Yeah, me too, man. I feel like we have so many things in common in terms of what we like to photograph and what our journeys have looked like. And I think this is going to be really fun.
Absolutely agreed. Upon learning of your work years ago, I immediately saw that in terms of our focus on the mountains, our focus on our respective local landscapes. And so, yeah, same. Likewise, definitely looking forward to diving deeper into that.
Awesome, man. Well, for people who aren't familiar with you and your awesome photography, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, certainly. My name is Scott. I am a Seattle-based outdoor photographer, filmmaker. I can't believe it. The time has flown by, but I'm just surpassed my 10th year as a full-time creator. So yeah, I made the jump back in 2015. In addition to those main hats, so to speak, I have a few other hats. I'm a mountain climber, a lot like yourself, Matt. Workshop instructor, occasional speaker, wilderness first responder, husband, son, brother, uncle, but taking kind of a huge step back. I'm originally from the Midwest, born and raised in Minnesota, lived most of my life there and met my wife there in college, but although she's originally from Washington State, we started our life there and my original career there, which was in the law. And in 2013, we had the kind of slightly spontaneous opportunity to make the move out of state to Seattle and back to the state where she was born and raised. And we made the jump. And I continued with my original career at the time, at least for a short bit. I was an attorney, and I understand I'm not the first attorney turned photographer on your show. I think I've listened to a few episodes, or at least one, where that's been the case.
Yeah, I was going to say Ian Plant, I think, is the first one that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and the name of the gentleman is escaping me, but I think a few episodes ago there was another one. But we're not a dime a dozen. We're a rare breed. But yeah, I think upon moving to Seattle, I slowly discovered the mountains here for myself personally, and they slowly kind of took over and transformed kind of the way I wanted to, kind of live the rest of my life and transform my path in life. And specifically, it's this local landscape in this mountain range, the Cascades, and in particular, the North Cascades. And yeah, they really just took over. And without being presumptuous or naive about the huge privilege that I had to make that jump and that transformation. It was in 2015 that I made the jump from the law to full-time photography and proceeded 1 year at a time. And now I'm, in my 10th full year and haven't looked back and haven't regretted a thing, and always recognizing room for growth year in and year out. So it's been an amazing ride thus far.
Awesome. It's funny, every time I fly to Vancouver, I make sure I get a seat on the right-hand side because I go from Denver to Vancouver. And I'm like, okay, about halfway through the flight, I look down and I'm just like, oh my God, look at the North Cascades. They are so impressive.
Yep. I have similar conversations with my wife. We're like, okay, do we want a view of Rainier or do we want a view of the North Cascades, depending on like the route of the flight? And always trying to make those hard decisions, but those are good hard decisions.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm super curious, like, how did you make the leap from practicing law to pursuing photography full time? And maybe what were some of the early moments that convinced you that the mountains would be your focus?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and I have a hard time answering how I made the leap because there's kind of like a million little things and a million steps that I took. But at its core, back in 2015, one day I was a full-time, attorney and associate at a law firm kind of in the Seattle downtown area, and I put in my notice for 2 weeks. Usually when you give notice, an associate gives notice to, say, a legal partner, they assume you're going to a different law firm. And so they had huge smiles when I told them that I was jumping from the law to photography. So after that 2-week, notice expired, I went from 100% attorney to 100% scared freelancer, jumping in the water and ready to learn. So that was that at its core, but leading up to that, being the diligent attorney that I was, did a lot of research on preparation and just exploring what that meant and what that would look like to become a full-time photographer. But in the year after moving to Seattle in 2013, I went on, some of my very first hikes. I went on my very first backpacking trip. And I remember taking photography, which was just merely a hobby at the time. And for the first time ever, taking imagery that really like documented and portrayed this like rich experience and connection that I was building with nature, and taking some of the first imagery that I felt that I was ever really proud of and to have created. And so something was growing inside me within that first year of becoming a Seattleite. I was becoming someone who really enjoyed and appreciated nature and wanted to deepen that experience of nature in this local landscape. And I was a budding for learning at a kind of increasingly rapid rate and becoming a much more, serious in that hobby. And I remember this kind of relates to, both your work and my own. And total side note, Matt, I wanted to congratulate you on the success you've had backing and building your book, The Colorado Way. I'm a proud backer among many others. But why I bring that up is I was at a gear shop in Seattle within that first year of Seattle. And I was, probably buying that next piece of gear for my outings, because I was just building my kit at that time. And I picked up a photography book that I just happened to notice. And it was a photography book about the North Cascades in winter. It is a book I still own this day. It's sitting on my coffee table. It's called Snow and Spire. The author and the photographer behind the book is John Skurlock, who's a Bellingham-based aerial photographer. But I remember picking up this book and looking at this imagery of these mountains and literally reading the words North Cascades for the very first time and being truly blown away by the fact that these mountains, this amazing, rugged local landscape, was just hours away from my home in Seattle. And that is just kind of a testament to, I think, the power of photography as a whole, the power to putting our work in print and sharing it with others. And you never know with whom that imagery is shared and that printed material is shared, what it will do for them and what journey it will send them on.
Mm.
And for me, it sent me on an amazing journey where I couldn't get enough of these mountains. Back before I made the jump from law to photography, I was catching myself daydreaming every single day about these mountains, about, oh, what's that next backpack I could do? Oh, I want to get into Alpine climbing. I need to learn the skills about mountaineering and how to get further up into these mountains, and just being completely in awe and wonder and having the curiosity about like what's in that next valley down the way, what's further into that next valley, what's along that ridge line. And so the local landscape here, the Cascades, and in particular the North Cascades, really just truly captivated me without exaggeration, and kind of took over my psyche in a way that my original career in the law was my interest in that original career was dwindling, and I had to act. And so for a variety of reasons, personal, creative, just ambition wise, of course, speaking with my wife, who was and still is incredible support of this journey that I'm taking, we made the decision that I would jump from the law to photography, test it out for a year, see how it would go, and take it, from there.
Yeah.
But a ton of research was done. I remember chatting with local photographers who were already established, asking them what it was like to be a photographer. Of course, honing those skills that are the core of the technical skills that are part of photography, learning about building portfolios, etc. Again, that's where those million steps that led up to that decision kind of live. And but it all kind of came to a head when I made that jump and basically started to learn to swim in the freelancing waters.
Yeah. So obviously a lot has changed since 2013 when you dove in that way and got really serious about it. I'd be curious to hear maybe kind of a two-part question here. What maybe was like the pivotal moment where you realized like, okay, this is actually going to work out. I'm going to actually find some success in this space. And then two, I'd be super curious to hear you talk a little bit about if you were to start it, like if you were starting in 2025, 2026, what would be different?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of a pivotal moment that I feel like, that maybe had me realize that I could continue doing this, I would say it maybe came both before, but more so after I actually made that transition. Even though I said I was 100% attorney one day and then the next day I was 100% scared freelancer, and that is true, I did start to build, say, brand relationships and a body of work prior to that. And in the wake of that, was doing additional branded work and building my portfolio. And I think there were enough, I kind of failed to mention at the outset, even though I am a landscape photographer and a mountain focused photographer, the core of my business is commercial photography, working with brands and clients, on branded work and what have you, and on assignment. But I think I had enough projects that popped up, and I think I fostered enough, well-rounded relationships in the year or two that followed making that transition that kind of gave me a bit of confidence in being able to keep building and continuing. Those were, relationships that had become long-standing relationships over many, many years with brands, and also just the curiosity and just the drive to like dive further into the landscape, the local landscape, and grow as a photographer, both landscape wise and commercial wise. So not really like one specific moment, but I think I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to connect with and build really strong relationship with some brands that I think gave me enough confidence that I'm like, I can keep going with this. And again, without being presumptuous, but keep pushing forward and continuing with this new dream, which was seemingly a 180-degree turn from my original career in the law.
Right.
Now, the second part, if I were to make that jump today, gosh, I honestly haven't thought about that, but specifically making it full-time work.
Yeah.
I feel like it would be, I don't think I have a great answer for that, but I feel like I would be a bit more intimidated.
Yeah, same.
You and I both know, the trade and profession or work as a photographer has blown up in popularity. The rise of social media, of course, social media was very much a thing back in 2015. the idea of being a photographer, whether it's for part-time work, a side hustle, or full-time work, is much more ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like I would be a bit more intimidated going in. I would hope to think that it wouldn't be a deterrent for me going in, and I would certainly hope it wouldn't deter me from growing and building and growing as a photographer, at its core, work and business aside. But yeah, anybody going in, I think, although there's certainly pathways, I can imagine it being a bit more intimidating. I'm curious what if you would say something about if you had made the jump, in the 2025, what would that look like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like people who came up in the early mid 2010s, like we did, I feel like social media was a lot easier in terms of, like you just publish a few images and like people like them and there's a lot more organic growth. And I think the one thing that I would do that I think both of us did, I would probably even more double down on would be kind of that focus on a local place or a passion project or something that I'm super, super excited about that like, I don't even care if other people like it or not. I think I would just double down, triple down on that concept of being really passionate about a specific subject or project and then just make my entire identity about that thing.
I like that. And I'm glad you brought that up. That is actually advice related to some advice that I give to, say, budding photographers or photographers, say workshop students who come to me and ask about, advice about starting, photography as work. And I love that idea. And I think we both exemplify this idea of kind of deep diving and having a focus in our local landscape or a landscape, and having it almost sharing a sense of identity with that landscape.
Yes.
I think it's all the better for it to be a local landscape is that space that we can repeatedly return to. We gain like a greater depth and familiarity with it, and just the intimacy of understanding and the nuance and the subtleties of how the landscape changes from season to season and from day to day is I think a foundation for us to grow a really like meaningful body of work. And so that's exactly why I've like really smiled when I came to learn of your work, Matt, and be like, yeah, I kind of see a mirror image of my relationship with the Cascades, and the North Cascades seem like your relationship with the Rockies and the Colorado Trail and the 100 peaks in Colorado. And given my journey, which I have yet to mention, one of my projects being the 100 peaks of Washington State, which a project I wrapped up last year. So cool to see those parallels. And I think we were chatting before we hit record about how we're going to have to connect in each other's respective states and maybe go climbing and kind of carry those parallels a little further.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I have it a little bit easier here in Colorado because of our rich history of mining and all that. We have a lot easier access to our mountains than you do in the North Cascades. I've always like every time I do research about a North Cascades trip, I'm like, wow, that is a lot of elevation gain and a lot of bushwhacking and like Devil's Club and all kinds of nasty things that you got to think about that you don't have to really care about here in Colorado.
It's what I like to call character building
Yes,
outings.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk more about the mountains and the projects that you've undertaken. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the unique challenges of photographing mountains technically and mentally, and how you approach scale, weather, and risk in the field as a photographer.
Yeah, that's the unique challenges of photographing mountains, I think, are many. I would say, first and foremost, I would say maybe the obvious, it's the physical and mental demands that are unique to mountain photography. You're really balancing like two disciplines, at least how I generally am moving in the mountains. It's, bigger treks or alpine climbs, mountaineering missions. So you're balancing that climbing with, and all that comes along with that climbing, the physical part, the mental part, the safety considerations with the pursuit and the drive in creating art and photography. And so balancing those two.
Mm-hmm.
the former, just climbing by itself, photography aside, as we both know, requires a complete focus on safety. And I pride myself on truly making that a priority. The whole joke of safety third is just a joke for me. And, focusing on movement and efficiency. And then, comparing that with photography, it's, sometimes the pace of climbing doesn't gel with the pace needed to create your best photography and your best work. And sometimes you simply can't wait for the best light, for example. And so, and then there's other considerations like all of the gear and equipment, especially for more technical climbing, whether that's glacier travel or alpine rock climbing, helmets, ice axes, crampons, the weight of carrying that gear and leaving room for photography gear. And, sometimes you have to essentially, make huge, cuts in terms of photography gear so that you can safely complete the climbing mission. Sometimes I'm, basically making a decision about a lens or two doing the job where I would ideally like to have, more.
For sure.
Yeah. And then I would say, as we both know, just how the weather can shift so quickly in the Alpine. Light can go from golden to flat in minutes. Storms can roll in, especially this time of year. And we don't always have the luxury of waiting for the perfect light. Again, when you're pairing, say climbing or more technical outings with the pursuit of photography. And sometimes you're literally tied to your partners by a rope. And so to not only move efficiently and safely, but not, risk the safety of that other person, that climbing partners, are huge considerations. So to kind of touch up, you asked about how do I approach scale, weather, risk in the field. I will say I definitely prioritize safety in terms of climber standards. I would consider myself more cautious than your average climber. And I think my climbing partners can attest to that. I'm like the thorough climbing partner who prepares the Google Doc at the beginning of the trip with like emergency contact information and things like that. I just want to make sure, like the baseline safety of a trip is, goes without saying. And I often find by kind of, dotting those I's, crossing those T's, I do open up room for better photography.
Yeah.
Because we're on the same page with, the folks that I'm climbing with, and we're able to get to where we need to go efficiently and build in time for, say, a sunset shoot, down off the ridge, or if we're sleeping up high, getting to a good spot and having time to shoot the best light. A lot of unique challenges, but I think it makes it all the more rewarding, in my opinion. I can only assume you would agree.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up because it's something that I've put a lot of thought into over the years in terms of how I feel about those photographs versus the ones that maybe were captured on the side of a road. And not to say that that style of photography is lesser than, but from a personal perspective, I've always had so much more pride and enthusiasm and excitement about the images that I know would be almost impossible to replicate. The experience of getting to that spot, seeing the light in that particular location, experiencing the moments where you have like mountain goats and crazy light and awesome clouds and jagged peaks in all directions. And like, it's really difficult to explain to someone who's never experienced it before.
Agreed, 100%. Yeah, it's hard to convey. And with the imagery we take, we attempt to convey that experience, but gosh, so much, especially with how rich and like how in the moment you have to be climbing in the mountains. It's so hard to truly convey that experience. And if anything, as your work has done, and I hope my work has done, it inspires our work and hopefully inspires others to take that step outside and experience whatever outdoor space they're able to visit and experience themselves, whether it's a mountain range or another natural area. So that's all we can hope. And I guess a lifetime spent attempting to create work that truly conveys that experience and the depth of that connection with that local landscape. I'd say that's a life well lived.
Yeah, well said. Well, so let's talk about your projects. So you've got the 50 Peaks project and the Washington 100. project. Maybe tell us a little bit about those two projects and kind of how they're similar and or different.
Yeah. So I guess a few years into being a full-time photographer. So I made the jump in 2015, the proverbial jump. And by 2017, I was, I had the privilege of working with a lot of great brands and clients. And in fact, I was actually traveling quite a bit in the year of 2017. So much that I think I tacked on a personal trip to Antarctica following a shoot down in Patagonia. And it was officially me touching all 7 continents in the calendar year of 2017.
Wow.
And so such an amazing year that really broadened my horizons in a variety of ways. And I kind of took a liking to the fact of having a larger scale project, even though that was kind of part work, part personal. Kind of towards the end of 2017, as I was wrapping up what I called the 7 Continents project, it was clear that I was ready to spend much more time in this local landscape, the Cascades, the North Cascades, at that local landscape that really transformed my path in life and had me make that jump into photography back in 2015. And it was at that time in late 2017, wrapping up that global, that international travel, that I learned that North Cascades National Park, one of the 3 national parks here in Washington State, and really the national park that represents the mountain range that is truly my happy place and probably the most special landscape in my life, was turning 50 years old in 2018. And I immediately knew I wanted to celebrate and do some sort of project to shine a light on the national park for that anniversary. And I came up with the idea of a project that I coined the 50 Peaks Project. Again, this is 2018, where I climbed 50 peaks inside the national park proper during that 2018 climbing season to celebrate that anniversary. And it was, like other projects I've done, multifaceted. It was part physical feat to push myself in terms of a kind of a budding mountaineer and climber. It was part documentation of the range and the park and all of the ecosystems that live within that park. And it was very much part shining a light on the national park, on that local landscape, and like deepening my connection with that local landscape and hopefully inspiring others to look at the local landscapes around them and how they can deepen their own relationships with their own local landscapes. So 2018 was pretty much the year of that initial project. Again, 50 peaks. I was able to climb those 50 peaks with a host of new and old climbing partners. I was able to really deepen my connection with that mountain range, with the national park, even with the administration of the national park. And it was a truly fulfilling, truly rich project and experience that I was so thankful that I was able to do. That list was a list of my own making. It wasn't defined by height. I really wanted the peaks to canvas the landscape, to not only climb like classic peaks like Forbidden Peak, which is one of the 50 classic climbs in North America, but also like obscure peaks in like the far corners of the range. And that was for the purpose of like just wanting to really experience the breadth of the mountain range and the national park and document the experience and the landscape along the way. And I still to this day look back on that 50 Peaks project as one of my favorite projects I've ever completed. And I'm so thankful I was able to do that and hopefully make a bit of an impact and change and help with that national park by, shining a light on that park, fundraising for that park through the Washington's National Park Fund. Moving beyond 2018, that project really, was near and dear to me and still is. And fast forward to 2022, I wanted to do something similar to the 50 Peaks project and, was kind of, kind of at a loss for what that project would be. And I eventually landed on the idea of wanting to climb the 100 highest peaks in Washington State, all of which sit within the Cascade range. They're not congregated. They're not all sitting in the North Cascades. They are across the Cascade range. There is a concentration within the North Cascades. I wanted to take on another project of this sort at that time of kind of conjuring the idea of that project, which I have come to call the Washington 100 project, I had already climbed about 25 of those 100 peaks, but I made the decision that I would reclimb those 25 in addition to the 75 that I hadn't climbed, and do so within 2 climbing seasons, the 2023 climbing season and the 2024 climbing season.
Wow.
Now, yeah. No,
That's a lot, dude.
it was aggressive for me in light of the fact that I wanted to bring along my camera gear and document the landscape, document the experience that I and my climbing partners were having, and among other things. And so for context, this list, which is called the Bulger list, it's kind of a unique name, but it relates to the name of the original mountaineering group back in the 80s that essentially identified these 100 peaks. This Bulger list had been climbed before. At the time in 2022, when I was, thinking up this project, there had been, I think, 80 some people ever who had completed the list. And there actually had been, I think, 1 or 2 individuals who had completed in a single season, and which blows my mind. And I knew right away that that was not for me. As a photographer, and as both you and I know, Matt, by increasing the speed of an outing unnecessarily I shouldn't say unnecessarily, but by having speed be a goal of an outing necessarily, in my opinion, cuts against the goal of photography for that outing.
Yeah. It's impossible.
Yeah. And I knew right away that if I attempted it in a season, even assuming I would be able to do that physical feat, that it would undermine what I would want to do from a photography perspective, what I would want to document along the project. So let's make it 2 seasons, I thought. So, and again, like my 50 Peaks project, I wanted it to be more than a climbing project. I don't think the world needed someone like myself out there touting the physical feat of climbing 100 peaks. I didn't want it to be that. I wanted that for myself. I wanted the physical challenge. I wanted the journey. I wanted to deepen that really already deep connection with this local mountain range, even take it a bit further. So I wanted to make it more than that. I wanted to climb with a huge host of new and old climbing partners, some of whom that I've, had climbed with from the very beginning, who put an ice axe in my hand for the very first time and crampons on my feet for the very first time, but also individuals that had not ever really done a climb, and to have that new experience with them and almost see the range anew through their eyes.
Oh, yeah.
I also brought in a kind of a group of nonprofit partners to the project. Groups like Washington's National Park Fund, which is kind of the exclusive charitable partner of the national parks here in Washington State. Groups like Washington Trails Association, which is one of the most amazing nonprofit organizations that are doing amazing work in terms of, trail work, trail parties, and making these outdoor spaces much more accessible and inclusive for so many other people. Groups like Climbers of Color, Ski Jumps, and what have you. And just these groups that are doing really important work in the outdoor space, making experiences more accessible to folks, putting gear in people's hands. And so I wanted to partner with them, again, similar to what I did for the 50 Peaks project, but shine a light not only on this local landscape, but shine a light on the important work that those groups were doing, and partner with them in a variety of ways, have them participate in climbs at times. For me to partner with them and get out on, say for the Washington Trails Association, join them for a trail work party that was a trail to one of my peaks and document the important work that they were doing on the trail, among other ways of partnering with those nonprofits. And so the Washington 100 project was similar in that I wanted it to be bigger than just myself in the physical feat of climbing those peaks and documenting those peaks. I wanted it to have some sort of give back, and again, never being presumptuous about how meaningful that give back was. I wanted to do my best to leverage the privilege that I have of climbing and hopefully do some good along the way of that journey. And unlike 50 Peaks, needless to say, that list of 100 peaks was set in stone. That Bulger list is unchanging. And so I had no wiggle room, which made it all the more tricky. I often think if my 50 Peaks in terms of climbing and mountaineering was, an undergraduate degree. I would say my Washington 100 project was, a doctorate. And so I really had to refine my skills and really make strong connections with my climbing partners in terms of safety and just, getting out there in a way that, was comfortable with everybody and having really amazing shared experiences that'll really stick with me for the rest of my life.
I love that. As you were talking, first of all, I was like super jealous. I'm like, oh my God, that sounds like such an awesome, 2 years, like to really dedicate. I mean, it seems like you've dedicated almost 100% of your entire life to that project for 2 years, right? And as I'm listening, I'm like, how did he do that? Because I feel like, in order to commit that strongly to one project for 2 years, you kind of have to make some sacrifices in terms of commercial projects that you would have liked to have taken on, or maybe other aspects of running a business as a photographer that might have to kind of go to the wayside for a minute in terms of like teaching workshops or whatever. So how were you able to make that work?
Good question. I knew from the beginning that those 2 years would not be typical years for me in terms of my photography business of being self-employed. Like before I made the jump from my original career into photography, I had some pretty serious heart-to-heart chats with my wife, Jill, and again, an incredible supporter of my work. And so, yeah, we knew going in that this would not be a typical year in terms of business for me. I wasn't pitching commercial assignments and projects. I wasn't, pursuing the normal opportunities that I would pursue. And I will say the project as a whole, all the experiences, the trip planning, we were way more all-encompassing and time-consuming than I had any idea I would. So even though I knew it was going to be an atypical, year in both 2023 and 2024, yeah, I was fixated on and obsessed with climbing the list and creating these experiences with the climbing partners that I got out there with, and connecting with these amazing nonprofits doing important work. And it was an all-engrossing experience. How I did it, I just knew that it was not going to be a typical year. And so this year, I completed the Washington 100 project last October, so 11 months ago, and October of 2024. And so this year might represent a little bit more of this quote unquote status quo, and which I knew would return in large part following the project. But I knew that I was going to be dedicating much of my personal time to this project, and I was ready to do that. And I'm so glad I did.
Yeah. I'd be curious, what advice do you have for people who are like, oh, I've got a job and everything's fine, but I really would really love to just dive into this photography thing. I feel like so many people don't have a grasp of really what all is involved in terms of the dedication. And I'd be curious to hear in your own words, like, what does it look like for you, and what advice would you have for someone even thinking about doing that?
Yeah, I try to be real with folks, and I am the first to admit I had, an incredible, a unique opportunity to turn away from that original career and the huge investment. I don't even want to get into the investment of law school and
Right.
things like that. So I had a unique opportunity, that privilege in doing that, and not everyone has those opportunities and that privilege. But I think hopefully realistic advice that I give folks is do what you can to test out the waters. And I do believe you can test out the waters as a side hustle, however big or small. And that could look like, at a minimum, really reflecting on the work that you would want to do, what it would look like. Are you working with brands? Are you selling prints? Are you licensing images? Are you doing galleries? A whole host of things. Is it a mixture or a combination of those things? And then building a portfolio that represents those niches that you want your work to represent. And then if it is in the commercial realm, starting to build those connections with brands. The advice that I give to folks is take steps to, if you're already familiar with the brand, great. Say you use the products of, say, an outdoor retail brand. Awesome. That's a great groundwork or foundation for it. But I would say what I recommend to folks is take steps to not be a stranger to that brand. That could mean signing up for their email newsletter, becoming familiar with, say, their marketing material, That could mean going to an event that they're hosting locally and, experiencing that and maybe introducing yourself to a brand representative who's there at that event. There's a whole host of examples that an individual can take to become something other than a stranger to that brand, kind of in the same way that you're deepening connection with the landscape. If you're wanting to be a commercial photographer, for example, is basically building a connection with that brand one step at a time. And so that when you do reach out and maybe broach the idea of possibly working together, maybe you're pitching a project, you're not just a name on an email in an inbox. You are somebody that they may be familiar with, that they've connected with, that they know you've kind of invested your time in becoming familiar with that brand. So I think there are steps that folks can take on the side. And I understand there's huge time constraints. And say if somebody has a family, those time constraints are even spread more thin. As someone who has no children, it's my wife and I in Seattle, no kids, no pets. I don't want to be naive or presumptuous about what someone might have the bandwidth to do. But if it is something meaningful to you and you're truly curious, I think there are those steps you can take.
Awesome. Well, let's talk more about the photography side of things. So I'm curious, for listeners who are used to photographing grand scenics, grand vistas, what techniques do you use that help translate the complexity of alpine landscapes into strong photographs?
Yes, gosh, the art of photographing mountains in a way that attempts to do them justice. That's
Yes.
that's the age old task that you and I are going to be attempting for years on end. But there's the saying, "Right place at the right time," and I think that's thrown around as a joke. I think there is some truth to that. That's obviously not the full story, but I am a big believer in, again, if you have the time and the means of putting in reps and doing research and planning and trying to put yourself in the right place at the right time, perhaps getting lucky at times when it comes to conditions or lighting. And those experiences will build on each other and you will start to create some work that you are truly proud of that has a place in your portfolio. And so I think that comes from a lot of things. That comes from research and planning. That comes from curiosity, going, one ridge further if you're able-bodied and moving, say, in the Alpine. That comes from reps. And so yeah, right place at right time is thrown around as a joke, but to a degree, however big or small, I honestly think there's some truth to that.
Absolutely truth to that.
Yeah. But beyond that, there are some more concrete or specific tips I would give. To convey, let's say, the mountain shape or form of say a mountain or a ridge line, looking for, I would say, light that's better suited to show off and convey that. That's like side light or quarter light, for example. Sometimes, backlight can, even though it might not display, say, the textures and the details in the front of a mountain, it can also show the size and like how imposing a peak is, for example. For distant mountains, I'm a huge fan of the telephoto lens.
Yes.
And yes, compression of a telephoto lens. And I'm really spoiled here in the Cascades, and I know you have this phenomenon in the Rockies and in Colorado there, but the mountain layers that kind of unfold before you when you hit a certain elevation, and you put me on a summit or near a summit with a telephoto lens, and I'm there for an overnight. I'm a happy camper.
Yeah.
Some might say that that's kind of lazy photographer. You just, standing in generally one spot or one area, with a single lens. But I think there's a whole host of creative possibilities that you can create and that you can look into and compose. And I'm a huge, huge fan of the telephoto. And I certainly shoot wide shots, shoot the more classic or traditional landscape shots with a strong foreground and what have you. But I'm often going for the telephoto lens, and those types of shots really excite me. And then, just maybe a few other things. You mentioned scale earlier, and just, in terms of more concrete tips. And I know this is probably goes without saying and is maybe obvious, but to convey scale of a peak is including a reference point. This could be a fellow your hiking partner, your climbing partner. That could be something like an Alpine hut. That could be even a tree, something that gives a sense of scale. But know that the flip side of that, you could also, whether it's a mountain or some other geographical feature within the mountains, like a waterfall, what have you, you can also omit any reference point that gives scale and for the sake of creating a sense of mystery.
Mm-hmm.
So being mindful of what you want to convey, what you don't want to convey. Do you want to instill or produce an understanding within the viewer, or do you want the viewer to experience kind of a whole host of questions of like, what am I looking at? How big is the thing that I'm looking at? How far beyond the frame does this thing extend? So being aware of your why and what you're wanting to convey with each image, and basically, using these compositional tools and techniques, none of which are truly hard and fast rules, but tools in a toolkit. And do I want to use this tool? Do I want to use this technique? And will it help me say what I want to say with this image?
Yeah, to your point, I feel like that was something that was lacking for me for a long time in terms of intention. I'd always get to the top of a mountain. I'm like, I just want to show everyone how cool this view is. Right. And so you get the wide angle on and you do like a 360-degree panorama and you're like, cool, that looks awesome. But then it's like, if you need to have a little bit more intention if you really want the work to stand out. And back to your point about focal length, I always get comments about this photo behind me because they're like, oh, that's such a grand scenic shot. And it's like, they're like, so you were like at 14 millimeters or what? And I was like, actually, it was like a 50 millimeters, a vertical panorama, like a 3-image stitch to get that whole scene in view and to compress some of those mountains a little bit more. So, don't be afraid to play around with different focal lengths and do some panorama work as well.
Yeah, right on. Well said. Yeah, and that is a beautiful image. I can imagine people kind of gravitating towards it and being curious how you created it.
Yeah, yeah. All right.
That I assume is, oh, sorry. I assume that that image is of Colorado, maybe of your 100 peak journey, which I wanted to mention as well. That's another parallel we have. So,
Yeah, it is. I photographed that scene in 2016. It's here in the San Juan Mountains, about 50 miles north of where I live. And it's the summit of Turret Peak at sunrise. To get there, you got to do this really challenging backpack up into this basin. And then it happened to coincide with the Perseid meteor shower. So I set up my camp, had dinner, and then about 10 o'clock at night, I hiked up to the ridge between the two prominent high 13ers up there, photographed the Perseid meteor shower all night. And then I climbed this mountain at sunrise and got to witness one of the most insane sunrises I've ever seen in my entire life.
sounds like a fruitful outing. That is amazing. That is awesome. And it's funny you mentioned the San Juans. Even though of all the states in the Western United States, Colorado, for whatever reason, is the state that I've visited and experienced the least. And that's why I'm so intrigued by your work and really am fascinated by the amazing, mountain imagery and other nature imagery you share, because of my, I think I share a bit of a sense of identity, or at least have a truly deep and strong connection with the North Cascades. There are a lot of folks that recommend the San Juans in Colorado to me and saying, beyond the North Cascades, if you like jagged, rugged mountains, that's the range to visit when in Colorado. I have yet to make the visit, and when I do, I'll absolutely be in touch.
Love it. Yeah, they have a lot of parallels for sure, except for we're a little bit higher, but we're a lot easier to access. So there's a
Yeah.
trade-off there, right?
There is a trail. I wish there was a little bit more accessibility within the Cascades, but I know there would be a give and take for that. I know sometimes, it's pros and cons, and you enjoy the more accessible spots when you can, and then you endure and later probably better appreciate those hard to reach spots.
Yeah, I have friends that are like, "Oh, you should go to the Winds in Wyoming." I'm like, "Yeah, they do look pretty amazing." Or I could drive 45 minutes and get something similar. It's like, that's the hard thing. It's like I really want to visit some of those places, but at the same time, I have such a deep connection to this place that I know they're two very different experiences, right? Like experiencing a new place that's similar versus a place you have a lot of familiarity with. And, as a photographer, there's benefits to both, but I tend to typically gravitate towards sticking closer to home personally. Yeah.
Exactly my approach as well. Yeah, absolutely can enjoy those other areas. You ultimately it does kind of feel like you're scratching the surface unless you
Right.
really take a lot of time there. So
Yeah.
for us to be able to do these deep dives, and I know that we're both very lucky in that having amazing outdoor spaces near our homes, but having the deep dives into those local landscapes, the repetition and the return visits, yeah, I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I was curious, I'm sure you have tons of really amazing stories from your Washington 100 project. Maybe tell us one of your most memorable stories from that project, maybe a close call or some wild breakthrough that you went through. Pick your poison.
Yeah. Gosh, there are so many outings that come to mind. In terms of close calls, I feel very fortunate to say I did not have anything too serious. Of course, there were moments of, say, rockfall. That's, in the Cascades, a crumbling mountain range. That's inevitable. But luckily, again, knock on wood, did not have any serious close calls. In terms of breakthroughs, I guess it's hard to choose just one. I'd say there are kind of breakthroughs in some sorts at the beginning, at the end, and even in the middle. So maybe just a few brief mini stories, if you will. But I will say back in spring of 2023, I set out to climb the first peak on my list in the Bulger list. And honestly, even though I had thought up this idea, I had done a lot of planning, I had not announced the project to, say the people around me, my audience, my world, so to speak. And so part of me was thinking like I would just try this first peak and see if like that kind of sealed the deal, or if that conversely confirmed maybe I shouldn't continue with this project idea. And so this was spring of 2023. So the first season of the 2-season Washington 100 project. And although I climbed, the vast majority of peaks with climbing partners, this initial very first climb was solo and was of Mount St. Helens, also known as, Lewitt to the indigenous people here. And I remember, that Alpine start. I think I probably woke up at 1 a.m. and I could see, headlamps around me of other climbing partners. But by the upper half of the mountain, to my surprise, found myself completely alone. And at first I was like, given the fact this had at that time was not one of those peaks that I had climbed, so it was at that time a new peak to me. I was wondering, am I off route? I'm like, no, I'm on route. I've got my GPS and everything. And it was well before sunrise. I remember stopping and taking like astrophotography, which, again, not your typical, experience for, say, someone doing a climbing project, stopping mid route to take astrophotography, but eventually found myself standing on the summit at the literal moment of sunrise, the sun hitting the eastern horizon. And I was all alone. And although I knew that the climbs ahead would involve climbing partners, it was such a special experience. And I was looking, to the northeast, seeing Tahoma, Mount Rainier, looking to the east and seeing Peyto Klickitat, also known as Mount Adams, and being like, yeah, this will be the start of the journey, and I'm gonna continue with this. And it was just something that just kind of confirmed that this was a journey I should take. And it was one of those moments that you and I have had plenty of, where you're up on a mountain and it's hard to articulate the feeling of being up there, and how what you see with your eyes and what you feel with your heart, it's hard to convey that and share that with anyone
It
in
is.
a way that's meaningful. But that was something that really, stuck with me, and it was clear that I wanted to continue with the journey.
It's so funny. Like people ask me, what are your top 10 favorite moments of your life? It's like getting married, the birth of my son, sunrise on top of North Eolus, sunrise on top of Jagged Mountain. It's all sunrises from the tops of mountains.
They stick with you. As somebody who doesn't have a great memory, it's amazing how vivid
Yeah.
and just entrenched I must have been in the experience up on these peaks. So yeah, so in terms of breakthroughs or just, I guess remarkable moments, I would say that peak one was a big one and really sealed the deal about how I was going to commit to the project. There were other peaks, like Peak 20, Good Mountain in the North Cascades, which was a peak I missed in the 50 Peaks project. That 50 Peaks project peak list was one of my own making, so it was a bit organic. And Good Mountain is the highest peak in the North Cascades National Park, and so it was a real treat to finally climb that peak again after quote unquote missing it, or at least originally wanting to do it back in 2018 as part of the 50 Peaks project. So many other peaks, the Chilliwack subrange, a number of peaks there, in the 70s, 80s of the Washington 100 project. And then maybe just one final mini story, finishing on Forbidden Peak, Peak 100, last October 2024. I didn't think that the project was actually going to get completed. There had been a closure due to a wildfire, and the road, basically the means of even getting to the route to climb Forbidden, was off limits. And I didn't want to, run afoul of area closures or anything like that. I wanted to do it right. And, October comes around, and usually not the time of year you're climbing Forbidden Peak, and the west ridge of Forbidden Peak, which is again, I think I mentioned earlier, one of the 50 classic climbing routes in North America, kind of a 5.6 rating on Alpine rock. This incredible aesthetic ridge line with, 1,000 feet of exposure on either side. And, October is the time when those early snowfall, the snowfall comes around. And luckily, the closure lifted. There was enough precip that knocked out the wildfire. The door opened up. My amazing climbing partner, Kimber Cross, and I went there and climbed it. I think it was mid-October of last year. And it was her first climb of the West Ridge of Forbidden Peak in a bucket list climb for her. We made our way up the approach gully, which is called the Cat Scratch Gullies. Very sketchy. Made it up to the ridge proper, the West Ridge. Simeled much of the ridge. Kimber led the crux pitch, which was so amazing to see her tackle that pitch. And we found ourselves on the summit that mid-October day, and we were just on cloud nine. So it was that peak, a breakthrough in the sense that I didn't think it was ever even going to happen, or at least happen within the window that I wanted to. But ended up happening. The stars aligned, and I couldn't have asked for a better climbing partner in Kimber to do that peak with. And so we were all smiles for the rest of the trip after that.
That's awesome. I keep coming back to this idea that I think maybe you're underselling a little bit of like how much of an amazing undertaking this was. Like, maybe convey a little bit for the audience, like what is entailed to just accomplish one peak of the 100 in a 2-year span? Like, we're talking how much approach mileage, how many days per peak? Like, what are we talking here?
Yeah, there's there's kind of a wide variety of peaks. There are a small handful of peaks that have trails essentially going to the top and to the summit. And then there are other peaks that are purely cross-country routes, essentially not a faint, a glimpse of any sort of proper trail.
Right.
And very rough terrain, whether it's bushwhacking, scree fields, talus fields, gullies, couloirs, ridge lines, what have you. So there can be climbs that range from a partial day and then other climbs that are multi-day if you're taking any sort of time, unless you're, an elite trail runner. So yeah, it can vary widely. And then there's, of course, the rock routes, and then there's the volcanoes. Every single volcano in Washington State is, of course, on the Bulger list, on the top 100 list. Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Glacier Peak, Mount Baker. So those come with a whole host of other, skills needed that comes with glacier travel. Learning how to travel on a rope team across the glacier in a way that navigates crevasses, and you are prepared to, say, rescue someone out of a crevasse if things go, wrong and somebody partially or fully falls into a crevasse. So huge range of skill sets that vary from peak to peak, but it definitely tested me in a variety of ways. I remember trying to think if it was peak 74. It was a peak in a sub-range in the Passaic Wilderness. The sub-range is called it's kind of colloquially known as the Shell Rock Group or the Lago Group. And there's about 7 of the top 100 peaks within that sub-range. And my wife, prior to the trip, my wife actually got COVID, and it was fine. It was a mild case, but it resulted in me doing this trip. She was essentially like, it's not so severe that, I need care. Basically just get out of the house and kick me out the door. No, joking. But I did this trip, and I was like, in the event that I was exposed to COVID, I don't, of course, want to get a climbing partner sick. So I ended up doing this solo, and, it was, I don't know what the mileage was one way. It was probably 15, 20 miles on pretty partially rough trail, and then probably some of the most rough cross-country terrain I've ever come across. It was part burnt blowdowns as far as the eye could see. I remember just being covered in charcoal, essentially, and then reaching beyond that point and going up, a steep remote trail. And I remember maybe I had just a pinch of COVID because I was running so low on steam. And this, again, was 3/4 of the way through the project. And I remember having to stop every few minutes. And I'm like, this is unlike me. And I was just so burnt out. And I think I learned at that time that some of the hardest peaks, the peaks that involve any sort of bushwhacking, rough terrain, remote peaks, that they are best shared with climbing partners. I consider myself a bit of a lone wolf, at least in past years. I've always loved a good solo trip, but that was really kind of enlightening for me that there's a time and place for solo trips, but on those trips that are really taxing, really quote unquote character building, to share that with someone else makes a world of a difference. And so I did end up climbing that peak that I set out to get, but gosh, it took everything in me and damn near crushed me. I came back with the lesson that I'm going to be carrying out the rest of these peaks with climbing partners that can make the experience all the more enjoyable and keep the motivation and the spirits high.
I was doing some rough back of the napkin math as you were talking in terms of the time commitment to pull something like this off. And even without accounting for bad weather windows or, situations where you maybe have to give it 2 days, like based on, really crummy weather or whatever, I was thinking, maybe 150 days in the field, something like that. I'd be curious if you have a rough idea of actually what it took.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I think it ended up being over 50 outings. And I think it was with, in total, 5 or 36 different climbing partners, which was awesome to have that shared experience with others. And I think it was definitely over 100 days in the field. I don't believe it reached 150. It was definitely in the triple digits. And so what a gift, what a privilege to spend that much time in this local landscape, in this mountain range that I consider my favorite place on earth, the place that I hope to experience, to visit, to document, to learn about, to be humbled by for the rest of my days if I'm so lucky. So yeah, that was pretty awesome. I'm curious. Part of me is also envious of more normal tackling of projects, say the 100 Peak project. I'm curious. I actually not sure if I know the details of your 100 Peak journey in Colorado. What did that look like for you? Would you do it again the way that you've done it? Kind of what were the pros and cons in your eyes?
Love the question. So my journey spanned my whole lifetime. So I started climbing mountains when I was 4 years old with my parents. Climbing is a rough term, like easy hikes up super simple 13ers. Climbed my first 14er when I was 6. So that was, I guess, my first taste of the highest 100 right there. And then I probably got about 20 under my belt before college, and then took a big hiatus. And then after my son was born, I really kind of went at it with a vengeance. I was starting to get a little fat. I was playing a lot of video games and drinking Pepsi constantly. And I was like, you know what? I need to get back into being in the outdoors and climbing mountains is probably the best way to do that because I need a goal or else I'm not going to do it. So I set the goal to finish the Centennials, the highest 100 mountains, and I think that was in 2007, and finished in 2018. So that was pretty hardcore there for about 9 years, 10 years, and some summers. And I did a lot of like stuff that wasn't in the highest 100 along the way too, like stuff that was in the highest 500 because it was close by and why not kind of thing. But I would say there were some summers where I would, start climbing in May and finish in October, November, and I'd get 30, 35 peaks. And then some seasons where I'd only get like 5 or 6 because I was living in Oregon at the time. So it was every year was a little bit different, and didn't really get super serious about the photography side of it until 2011. So there's a lot of journeys a lot of really cool scenes that I didn't know what the heck I was doing yet with a camera. So would love to go back and revisit some of those scenes for sure.
Right on. That sounds like an amazing journey. And yeah, hopefully I'll get my first Colorado 14er or one of the ones eventually here. I'm sure it's a matter of time. But totally agree on the whole fitness part. I don't think there's any fitness program like the mountains. I would say they definitely whip me into shape as well.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about how you culminate all of this body of work that you've created with this project. I know that you're starting a book and you're going to call it Cascade High. What's your vision for the narrative of the book? How are you approaching the curation and sequencing? And what do you think will make it feel distinct from a peak by peak chronicle?
Yeah, appreciate you mentioning this. And yeah, safe to say it's still in its infancy. Will in large part be a photography book. My both documentation and more, artistic take on these 100 highest peaks in Washington State. The imagery will portray the landscapes in big and small detail. It will also include imagery of myself and my climbing partners experiencing these high peaks and the journeys that we had reaching their summits. So it won't be pure landscape. There'll be a mix of imagery. In addition to the imagery, like your upcoming book, The Colorado Way, but also like it will be supported with text, with writings. The writings, however, I think will be a little bit different than your essays that will find their way in The Colorado Way. I think my essays my writings will be, I think rather maybe less reflections and maybe more concrete stories from the journey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit, like I said, it's a work in progress. I'm hoping that I will finally have something to share with the world in 2026, but I'm a bit torn on the exact focus. There's a few things that I'm wrestling with, and I'm actually curious about the approach that you took with the Colorado Way. One level, I'm debating whether all of the imagery that would be included in the book would be from the Washington 100 project, or if I will supplement the imagery with images that I took in past years. And I mean, prior to even starting the Washington 100 project, I had almost a decade of documenting the Cascades. And even though I wasn't at that time back in, the 20s and the early 20s, wasn't climbing the Bulger list and the 100 highest peaks per se, I was still very much documenting a lot of those 100 peaks, whether I knew it or not. I,
Right.
Of course, by the time of the project, became much more intimately aware of which peaks fell within that list. So that's one thing I'm kind of wrestling with, and I think I'll eventually make a decision. And then also, I'm trying to, I don't envision it being a peak to peak chronicle as you asked about. I think I want to be a little more strategic in how the book is organized. It might be that it's organized by region and not necessarily say on a trip by trip basis. But I'm still wrestling with that. But I am hoping to do the range and this peak list justice. It feels like a big task to do it justice because there were so many climbs and experiences, some of which I felt like I was able to truly document the experience and the landscape and the peak well. And there were some outings that the climbing, and from a safety standpoint, a technical standpoint, and a logistics standpoint, kind of knocked the photography goal and angle down a rung or two.
Yes.
Not to Yeah, and I'm sure you can understand that, having climbed the 100 peaks and then having hiked the entirety of the Colorado Trail. But so it's still a work in progress. I'm so excited to put it together. I'm excited to eventually share with the world. I definitely glean inspiration from your upcoming book. I glean inspiration from other photographers who have been guests on this podcast. I'm thinking of, your conversation with William Neal. I have his book Light on the Landscape on my coffee table right next to me here. And so it's amazing how the photographers that share their work in the variety of ways that they do, how, they'll never know about the inspiration that they instill in others and what those others will create and the experiences and artwork that they create. So yeah, inspiration all around. And I know I'm in good company and gleaning that inspiration from folks. But yeah, I'm curious on the points that I mentioned about having imagery from, say, the project, say you're hiking of the Colorado Trail. Did you approach, if I may ask, the imagery that you included in the book more holistically and across the years, or did you have it more confined to that experience? And maybe any advice you'd have on, say, the writings?
Yeah, so the curation part for me was actually a little bit tricky because of the focus on the highest 100 mountains and the Colorado Trail, but also like my personal journey and how I wove in the essays. I mean, the essays are actually like the skeleton, and then the photography and all of that's kind of like, the meat on the bones. And so my approach was to, like, I was perfectly fine using images that I just had captured as a photographer, not as a climber, of, let's say, like a really amazing sunset of a mountain that I had climbed that had nothing to do with that particular climb, right? And so my thought process is, as long as it helps tell the story or convey the message or the purpose that you, or the intention that you have for the book, I think anything goes in terms of what you include photography wise. I actually included quite a few images in the book that were captured on a lot of my fall photography trips, where very rarely do I do any mountaineering on those trips. It's a lot of like, okay, I know about these mountains and I'm in love with this mountain, but I want to get with fall color below it and stuff like that. I did it. I included really a mixture of images, but with the main constraint of it being Colorado, and also images to help tell some of the stories that were in the book. So I think as long as it goes with the message and the intention, I think you're good, man.
I think that's solid advice. And I'm very likely going to head that way. I feel like it would pain me so much to not include like some of my favorite imagery that I took of these high peaks, in the years prior to the Washington 100 project. I mean, like even just the imagery that I took within the 50 Peaks project, many of which were, those high peaks or near those high peaks. So I think that's good advice. And I wouldn't be surprised if I end up taking a similar approach. The curation of the imagery that will make its way in the book.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to see what you do with it, and as soon as it comes out, please let me know.
Certainly, and thanks to you for the inspiration, and yeah, I'm excited to get my hands on your book soon myself.
Awesome. All right, man. So I guess my last question is, who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some people that we need to know about?
Yeah, I know this is the must ask question, so I had some time to think about it. I would say I would lead with recommending my friend and fellow photographer, Gina Danza. Her handle on social media and kind of branding is Wild Gina. She creates this intimate nature photography that is truly stunning. We have hanging in our house, and it's really adds so much to our space, and just huge fan of her. She's a Black intimate nature landscape photographer, kind of trailblazing, and I think she is just a great human and a great artist. I would definitely recommend looking into her work. For number two, a fellow photographer in the Pacific Northwest, although across the border, I think in the Vancouver area, is Lizzie Gadd. Amazing landscape work and truly special and unique self-portraiture. And I think when I see Lizzie Gadd's work, I think of, God, it just transports me to either a different time or a different world, fantasy world, almost like Lord of the Rings, what have you. Just the work that she creates, especially her self-portraiture, is absolutely stunning. It's likely you and the guests, the listeners, if you've seen, kind of this almost mystical landscape and an individual, say, in a red dress, which I think is one of her collections in her series of work, that very well might be Lizzie's work, and it's definitely worth checking out. And then lastly, a fellow local photographer who's been an inspiration to me from day one and who I reached out to and connected with about the time that I made the jump from the law to photography is Scott Rinkenberger, a truly talented photographer with a heavy focus on Alpine work and work relating to adventure sports in the mountains, whether that's skiing, climbing and what have you, incredible black and white work and just, and color work as well. But his work has stood out to me from day one. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention his work as well. So yeah, Gina, Lizzie, and Scott.
Perfect. Well, Scott, this has been amazing.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation, and even beyond this episode, really stoked to have connected with you. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. And I promise you, I'm going to get to Colorado and attempt my way up a peak or two.
Yeah, well, hit me up if you do, because it'd be fun to see it through your eyes like you did with the other people that joined you.
Yeah, no, likewise. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, that's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation with Scott Kranz, I hope you'll join us over on Patreon, where Scott and I recorded a bonus episode digging deeper into something we both care about, creating meaning with our photographs and building projects that actually change us. It's a good one, and you can unlock it at the $5 level along with over 250 other bonus episodes. As always, this show runs on a value for value model. If the podcast brings something to your creative life each week, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd consider supporting it. Patreon support has taken a real hit recently, and it's what keeps the show alive. Ad limited and coming out every single week. You can find more information in the link in the show notes. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.